Hello, my little historians, and welcome to Lesson 838 on the Bill of Rights. As always, the name of the lesson will always be across the top of the page. It will always be in bold. It will always be in caps. It will always include a numbering system, and this numbering system is 8 because you guys are in 8th grade, 3 because this is Unit 3 on the Constitution, and 8 because this is the lesson after Lesson 7 but before Lesson 9, specifically on the Bill of Rights. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. As always, the name of the page we are on will always be underneath that. It will always be underlined. It will always be in italics, that kind of slopey looking font. So let's go ahead and get started with our bell ringer. As always, I'm not going to tell you everything. I'm not going to fill in the blanks for you. I hope that you are paying attention, and then you'll be able to figure out the answers. So, blank was known as the father of the Constitution. Anti-Federalists feared a strong national government and refused to support the Constitution without a blank. Blank required American colonists to house British soldiers in their homes. The principle of blank says that everyone must obey the law. The principle of blank says that each citizen has personal freedoms that the government cannot take away. I don't choose these things at random. Every single one of these ties into what we are talking about today. So let's go ahead and get started. Blank was known as the father of the Constitution. Our key concept there is father of the Constitution. So if you go looking for it in a textbook, in the Perfect Study Guide, anywhere, if you look up father of the Constitution, you will see that the answer is James Madison. Why is he the father of the Constitution? Well, he wrote the Virginia Plan, he wrote several Federalist Papers, and he wrote the Bill of Rights. So, the Bill of Rights, that's today's subject, and that's why he's tied into it. Anti-Federalists feared a strong national government and refused to support the Constitution without that would be a Bill of Rights. We're going to talk about that some more as we move on. Blank required American colonists to house British soldiers in their home. Once again, the key concept there, it would be house British soldiers. The answer there is the Quartering Act. Just like we talked about headquarters. If you play something like, Call of Duty, for instance, headquarters is occasionally referenced. Headquarters is where the head of the army, the generals, quarter. That is the house that they are staying in. The principle of blank says that everyone must obey the law. That would be limited government, placing limits on the power of the government because the law is ultimate. The principle of blank says that each citizen has personal freedoms that the government cannot take away. That would be individual rights. So when you think about personal, think individual, freedoms, rights. And these two things tie together, personal rights as well as limited government, because the Bill of Rights is all about limiting the power of the government. That's why the Anti-Federalists wanted it. First of all, it would protect individual rights. Secondly, it would limit the power of the government. So let's go ahead and get started. So if you turn in your textbooks to page 204 to 205, you will see what the Bill of Rights are, what the exact text is, and then you can take it from there. In this case, I'm just going to go ahead and walk you through it. So we begin with this image right here. As you can see, this is not just a map of the United States, but it is a map of the states. Because it's not just an outline of the United States. We can see the borders of Texas. We can see the borders of Louisiana and Mississippi and all of these states throughout the entire country. So this is a map of the states in the United States. So when we think about states, we think about the 10th Amendment. Why? What does the 10th Amendment say? Well, the 10th Amendment says that there are powers in the Constitution that are not given to the national government, and those powers are reserved for the states. So that means that the Constitution spells out everything that the government is supposed to do, but in case we missed one, because that's what ICYMI is short for, in case you missed it, in case we missed one, we have more limits on the power of the national government. In the previous lesson, we talked about checks and balances and separation of powers and how that was dividing the power of the government. In this case, this is one more instance of how to limit the power of the government. So from there, we get this one, the right to get married and the right to choose your job. Now, the problem is that if you go looking through the Perfect Study Guide, for instance, you're not going to be able to find the answer. So how do you find the answer? Well, when you go through it, you will see that this is actually referring to the Ninth Amendment. Because what does the Ninth Amendment say? The Ninth Amendment says that there are rights that are not mentioned in the Constitution. For instance, the right to get married or the right to choose your job. So all of these are rights that exist, but they aren't talked about in the Constitution. So what do we do with those rights? Those rights go to the people. Those are the people's rights. Why is this important? Well, once again, this is an in case you missed it, because in all the previous ones, they were worried about the government being too strong, place limits on the power of the government. However, what if they overlook one and now the government is going to start abusing that power? In this case, this will restrict future power of the national government. So, as an example, the right to privacy is not spelled out in the Constitution. It wasn't that big a deal at the time, but now, especially when it comes to Instagram and all of these deep fakes and stuff along those lines, privacy is very important. So this is covered by the Ninth Amendment because it is a right not mentioned in the Constitution, but it is kept for the people. Next, let's take a look at this image in number 3. As you can see, that is a picture of a church. And when we think of a church, we think about the First Amendment. And the First Amendment covers freedom of religion. Pretty straightforward, and it makes sense when you think about it, because this is saying that the national government cannot interfere with religion. Remember, we talked about how the Anti-Federalists were worried the government was too strong, so they wanted a Bill of Rights, because a Bill of Rights will cover limiting the power of the government and protecting individual freedoms. Keep in mind, 5 out of the original 13 colonies were founded because the founders wanted religious freedom. And this is saying that the national government cannot interfere with religion. Now, all of these rights, the government can interfere once you start messing with someone else's rights. But until that point, the government has to stay out. Moving on. Next, we have this picture here. A lot of people are saying, I don't understand what's going on. It's just people sitting at home. Well, keep in mind, we've got this guy who is sitting on the chair watching TV, and then these 2 people don't look too happy about that. Now, what makes this guy different from everybody else? Well, as you can see, he's got some chevrons over here, and he's wearing a special kind of hat. This guy is in the military. So that means this guy is watching TV, and these other people are not happy about it. Put them all together, this guy is a soldier, and he is living in these people's homes. And that brings us to the Third Amendment. And the Third Amendment says that there will be no quartering of troops. What does quartering of troops mean? That means no housing of soldiers. Soldiers cannot live in a citizen's house during peacetime. During wartime, that's a different story. But during peacetime, soldiers do not live in a civilian's house. And this is a direct result of the Quartering Act. So this is why I had the Quartering Act in the bell ringer. The king abused his power during the American Revolution with the Quartering Act. So the Anti-Federalists are like, we don't want that to happen again. We want a Bill of Rights. Where are we going to put this Bill of Rights? Boom, quartering. Why is this important? Because, once again, it limits the power of the government. The government cannot force citizens to house soldiers. So, the citizens, that's protecting individual rights. The government cannot do this. That is limiting the power of the government. Next, we have this little picture that says, come back with a warrant. When do we hear that? Well, we've got 2 kinds of warrants that we've ever heard of. One is arrest warrants, and then the other one is search warrants. Anytime you watch a movie, somebody's like, hey, you can't come in here without a warrant. You can't go searching without a warrant. That would be our Fourth Amendment rights. And the whole point behind the Fourth Amendment is that it says that no government person can search or seize without some sort of lawful procedure. That's going to be a warrant, or that is going to be a probable cause. So no unlawful search or seizure. And what does seizure mean? Does seizure mean somebody who is twitching uncontrollably? No. Seizure means no taking of stuff. So if you are playing with your phone in the middle of class, Mr. Sweeney will seize it. That means Mr. Sweeney will take it. But there will be no unlawful search or seizure thanks to the Fourth Amendment. Why is this important? Once again, this is a limit on the power of the government. The government cannot search through your stuff. They cannot take your stuff without a lawful reason, either a warrant or probable cause. Next, we come to the Miranda warning. This is one of my favorite things to talk about because it's an example of you know what we're talking about, but you don't know that we're talking about. So the Miranda warning, when you get arrested, the police have to say, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Why do they say that? Why does it matter that anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law? That brings us to the Fifth Amendment. And the Fifth Amendment says that there will be no self-incrimination. That means the government cannot force you to incriminate yourself. What does that word even mean? Well, if you don't know, stop. Break it down. What is the root of the word incrimination? Drop the in, drop the ation. What have you got? Criminal. So self-incrimination means proving yourself to be a criminal. That means testifying against yourself. The government cannot force you to do that. The government cannot force you to give evidence against yourself. And this is a very important procedure because before this, certain governments were allowed to torture people until they confessed. Except if they're torturing you, you'll confess to make the torture stop, not because it's the truth. So this prevents self-incrimination. The Fifth Amendment also provides against double jeopardy. Double jeopardy means you cannot be tried for the same crime twice. Because once again, a government could abuse that power. They'll put you on trial saying, this guy did some horrible things. And then the jury says, well, no, he didn't. You have no evidence. Let him go free. So then the government just charges you again. No, that does not happen in this case. In this case, if you get charged with something and you are found not guilty, conversation is over. You cannot be charged with that crime again. Why are these important? Because these are all protecting the rights of the accused. There are several amendments that cover this, but the bottom line is this is protecting everyone because under our system, we believe all suspects are innocent until proven guilty, and all suspects have rights. The government can't just arrest somebody and throw them in prison. Nope, that's not how this works. What happens is the government arrests somebody, and then that somebody gets a trial. And that brings us to our next page. So, right here, we have a group of people who have gathered together so that they can protest. Because the fact is, if I want to stand up in my home and say, I don't like what the government is doing, whoop-dee-doo. But if I get 100 people together and I say the same thing, it's a lot more likely that people will pay attention. So, this is our First Amendment right, specifically the freedom of assembly. So, what is an assembly? If you guys get together in the gym for a pep rally, that's everybody in the school coming together. Everybody in the school gathering together. At the end of Avengers Endgame, Captain America says, Avengers, assemble. That means Avengers, gather together so we can fight Thanos. Same sort of thing here. So one more time, this is an example that says the government cannot restrict gatherings. Once again, when we talk about freedom of assembly, we are talking about the idea of bringing people together just so that you can criticize the government. The government cannot interfere with that. That's a way to limit the power of the government. I do not agree with what you have to say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. I love this quote. And I love this quote because it shows not just the First Amendment right of freedom of speech, but it also says what is more important is freedom of speech. Not whether or not I agree with you, just freedom of speech. That is more important. Everybody gets freedom of speech. Even if you don't like what somebody else has to say, everybody gets freedom of speech. Now, why is this important? Because people will use their speech to criticize the government. And the government cannot restrict speech. Once again, this is an example of limited government. The government cannot do something about this, and that's important. Now down here we have this little picture of this dude. Everybody thought it was Caillou. It's not Caillou. This is just a guy who was being punished. And back then, the way that they would punish you in this fashion was to lock you in this little setup called the stocks. It's very uncomfortable, and then people would throw rotten vegetables at you. So you committed a crime, people would throw rotten vegetables at you. It was humiliating. You could get seriously hurt. Somebody could throw rocks, etc. Why is this guy here? Because our Eighth Amendment says that there is no cruel or unusual punishments. It also says that there will be no excessive or too much punishment. So if I am speeding, the government is not going to slap me with a $50,000 fine. That is excessive. That is too much. If I am speeding, the government is not going to throw me in prison for 50 years. Once again, excessive, too much. So, in all of these cases, what they're saying is you need to rein in the punishments. They cannot be cruel, they cannot be unusual, they cannot be excessive. What punishments are okay? You can have a prison sentence. None of the stuff where people throw stuff at you or you get humiliated or you get locked up or tortured or anything like that. No, you got a prison sentence. You can pay a fine as long as it's not too much. You can have the death penalty in certain circumstances, or you can have community service. But in all of these cases, these sentences are not cruel or unusual or excessive. So this is a big, big deal because this is our way of saying we see the way that they deal with people over in England. If you've seen, Braveheart, for instance, Braveheart ends with the main guy being tortured horribly. And we're not going to do that. We have said we are going to throw out all cruel and unusual punishment. Moving on. This picture is kind of weird. A lot of people probably can't see it very clearly, but this is a picture of newspapers wrapped in chains. So these are chains around newspapers. This goes to our First Amendment freedom of the press. What exactly is freedom of the press? Is that like freedom to bench stuff and stuff like that? No. Freedom of the press actually refers to the printer. Because back in the day, when they made newspapers on what was called a printing press. So this says freedom of the press, which means freedom of the printer. So the idea here is if I want to criticize the government, I can publish newspapers, I can publish books, I can publish pamphlets, I can make a website. All of these are protected under the freedom of the press because, once again, this means the government cannot restrict what people print. One more time, this is a way to limit the power of the government and protect individual personal freedoms. So just like with all the other First Amendment freedoms, the freedom of assembly, the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, you use those for when you are criticizing the government. I want to talk trash about the government. I want to bring people together so I can talk trash about the government. I want to print stuff talking trash about the government. The government cannot punish me for that. Next, we have this picture of a guy who's got these weird little furry arms. What are those? Are those gorilla arms? No, those are bear arms. So that refers to our Second Amendment freedoms. Our Second Amendment freedom says every citizen has the right to bear arms. Now, are we talking about the arms of a grizzly? No, we are not. We are talking about the right to own guns. This is very important because if we go back to talking about the battles of Lexington and Concord, ordinary citizens, Minutemen, had their guns. They grabbed their guns and they fought back. So that's the entire point behind this. Government cannot take away citizens' ability to defend themselves, whether they are defending themselves against other citizens or whether they are defending themselves against the government. This is especially impressive because, keep in mind, Shays' Rebellion was happening at this time. A bunch of farmers who were ex-soldiers were shutting down government courthouses, and they said, even though this is happening, we want to protect everyone's right to defend themselves against an evil government. So, very big deal. This next one is really rough and kind of unfair for you guys. So as you can see, what it says here is the word lawsuit. Does anybody know what the formal term for a lawsuit is? The term there is something called what is called a civil case. So you've got criminal cases where somebody breaks the law and the government tries to punish you for breaking the law. In this case, this is a lawsuit. This is a civil case. So this is individuals who have problems with each other. So for instance, you talk to Chief Lard. Chief Lard serves in the military. That's why we call him Chief. But I never served in the military. I am a civilian. So I am just a regular dude. So when we talk about the Seventh Amendment, we are talking about civil cases. We are talking about a jury trial in a civil case, also known as a lawsuit, or when we are suing somebody. So just a case between two average guys, I get to have a jury. And this is important because if we are talking about lawyers or judges or something along those lines, they will have an idea of what justice is. And they will say, well, that doesn't accord with the law. Whereas with a jury, they're going to say, hey, you know what? That's not fair. And this gives more power to the people. Once again, this limits the power of the government and it gives more power to individuals. Because if I am talking to some government judge, he might not agree with me. But if I'm talking to other people who are like me, they'll probably agree with me. So that's the Seventh Amendment. Moving on. That brings us to this one. Once again, I don't really like this picture because it's a little misleading. This picture refers to the Sixth Amendment. And the Sixth Amendment says that every citizen gets a speedy public trial by jury, which means it's not just me versus some judge, it's me pleading my case to a bunch of people like me. It also says I have the right to a lawyer, which is very important because if we are talking about law, I want an expert on the law, and that's where the lawyers come in. So, all of this is important because, one more time, these are more protections for the accused. More people who are going up against the government has more restrictions on them. They can't just leave you languishing in prison forever. This trial has to be fast. They can't conduct a secret trial where nobody knows what's going on. This trial has to be public. It can't just be me versus some judge. This trial is going to have a jury. And it's not going to be some ignorant guy who knows nothing about the law versus a bunch of fancy lawyers. No, I get a lawyer too. All of these are covered by the Sixth Amendment. And the last one we have here is a little picture that says, by signing below, I oppose the closing of Oaksboro School. You guys have probably seen a lot of these, maybe regarding Breonna Taylor. This is our First Amendment right. It covers freedom of petition. Petition means to ask the government something. So whether that is, hey, we don't have something and we want something, like, for instance, the Green New Deal, or whether we have something but we don't want something, like an unfair law of some sort. The freedom of petition says we can ask the government, fix this problem. One more time, the government must answer citizens' concerns. The government cannot punish citizens because they're saying, hey, we don't like this. Citizens are free to not like it, and citizens are free to tell the government, I don't like this. So that's the whole of the Bill of Rights. It's a lot, but this is one of the most important lessons you're going to cover. Partially because it's covered on the STAR test, partially because this is an incredibly important lesson. I've got a lot of students who say, why should I care about a bunch of stuff that happened 200 years ago? This is happening today. Like I said, we mentioned petitions. A lot of people will use these when they're talking about, for instance, Black Lives Matter or something along those lines. The whole point behind a petition is that you are telling the government you want to change, and the government cannot punish you for that. So let's go ahead and take a look at our exit ticket. Which of these is a guarantee in the First Amendment? So remember, the First Amendment covers 5 different freedoms. That's RAPS. RAPPS. Religion, assembly, petition, press, and speech. So Which of these talks about religion, petition, assembly, press, or speech? I'm going to leave that up to you guys. So go ahead and take a look at this exit ticket. Let me know if you find the answer. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I look forward to teaching you guys about Lesson 839, specifically on how the Declaration of Independence influences the Bill of Rights. Thanks a lot. Take care, guys.